China's territorial dispute with Tajikistan traces back to the 19th century when the Qing dynasty's control over its western frontiers weakened after a series of rebellions and military defeats. During this period, the expanding Russian Empire negotiated multiple treaties with Qing officials. These included the Treaty of Tarbagatay, 1864, and the Treaty of Kashgar, 1884, which began defining borders across Central Asia. However, many of these boundaries were left ambiguous, especially in the remote Pamir Mountains. The region that is now eastern Tajikistan fell into this category claimed by the Qing dynasty, but largely mapped, garrisoned, and administered by Tsarist Russia. When the Soviet Union was created, Moscow inherited these earlier Tsarist-era claims. The Chinese government under both the Republic of China, 1912-1949, and later the People's Republic of China, after 1949, continued to dispute several sections of the frontier, arguing that Russian cartographers had pushed the borders deep into areas historically recognized by the Qing as part of Chinese-controlled Turkestan. The Soviets, meanwhile, insisted that the borders reflected actual control established by Tsarist Russia and maintained by Soviet authority. By the 1960s, Sino-Soviet relations collapsed, and both sides began issuing formal border protest notes. In these diplomatic exchanges, China repeatedly claimed that the Soviet Union had occupied around 28,000 to 35,000 square kilometers of territory in the eastern Pamirs, including parts of areas known as the Sarakol Range, the Karakoram-Pamir Junction, Markansu Valley, and the Fedchenko Glacier region. The Soviets rejected these claims outright. The dispute remained unresolved until the USSR disintegrated in 1991. With Tajikistan's independence in 1991, the unresolved Sino-Soviet border disagreement was inherited by the new Tajik state. However, Tajikistan entered independence amidst severe economic crisis and a civil war that lasted from 1992 to 1997. During this period, Tajikistan urgently needed external support, international recognition, and stable diplomatic relations. China, meanwhile, sought to resolve old Soviet-era border disputes to stabilize its frontiers and focus on internal development. In 1999, China and Tajikistan negotiated a provisional agreement to settle the long-standing territorial issue. This agreement was part of a broader wave of post-Soviet border settlements China conducted with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. According to Tajik Foreign Ministry statements at the time, Tajikistan recognized that the territorial claim China argued for, based on the 19th century Qing-Russian treaties, covered around 28,000 square kilometers. During negotiations, Beijing agreed to renounce the vast majority of this claim. The final legally binding settlement came in July 2011, when Tajikistan's parliament ratified an agreement that formalized the transfer of 1,158 square kilometers to China, primarily in the Pamir's eastern highlands within the Murghab region. Tajik officials described this transfer as 3.5% of the area disputed with China. Using Tajikistan's own figures, this implied that the historical disputed area was approximately 28,000 to 33,000 square kilometers, depending on the estimated boundaries. Chinese and Western scholars note that the broader historical claim China had referenced since the 1960s ranged from 28,000 kilometers to about 40,000 kilometers, depending on which maps were used from the late Qing and early Soviet era. In effect, China ceded its claim to more than 95% of the territory it had once argued over and formally received less than 1/200 kilometer. Tajikistan framed this as a diplomatic victory, stating that Beijing had accepted the smallest portion of the dispute. China framed it as a successful settlement that closed a historical issue peacefully. The reason the settlement is often described as quiet is that both governments kept public discussion minimal. There were no major announcements, no large diplomatic ceremonies, and no strong reaction from either population. Tajikistan's internal politics were focused on post-Civil War reconstruction, while China emphasized stability along its western borders and the development of Xinjiang. The agreement was signed and ratified without public debate, and the details were mostly limited to official communiques and statements to international organizations. From a historical standpoint, the final settlement was part of China's long-term strategy to resolve all lingering land border disputes inherited from the Qing-Russian frontier era. With Tajikistan, the settlement ended nearly 150 years of ambiguity over control of the high-altitude Pamir region. The final boundary today follows a line based on modern geodetic surveys conducted jointly after the 1990s negotiations. China didn't lose 40,000 km² in 2011 in the literal sense. Tajikistan administered these territories continuously during the Soviet period and after independence.